As a former American history teacher and as someone who writes primarily in the field of American history, I get asked all the time to recommend history books, so that's what this video is going to be. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my videos with 11 books that I recommend. This is going to be 11 books about American history that I would recommend to readers kind of in a general sense, but it probably would help if you had some kind of basic background of the outline of American history before you read lots of these. Now, I've already done videos similar to this year. I did a video on the importance of slave narratives, which I think are just incredibly important documents. I'll leave a link to that video at the end of this one. And I did a video about works by female historians that I thought people should read. I'll leave a link to that at the end below. And what I'm trying to do in this video is kind of highlight some books that I haven't talked much about, or in some cases haven't ever talked about on this channel, which I think provide some important insights, lessons, information about areas of American history. Obviously, with only 11 books and a couple of hundred years of American history, my list is going to be short. Some important books, and it's also going to be kind of idiosyncratic to me, books that I've read and I've valued and I've gotten insight out of. But this is my channel. And, that's what you get when you come here. So, just real quickly to run through those 11 books. The first book I have on my list is The War That Made America, A Short History of the French and Indian War by historian Fred Anderson. This is actually made into a PBS series, which I think you can still find. And it really, I think, introduces a topic that I know as an American history teacher I didn't spend much time on teaching, and that is what we refer to as the French and Indian War, sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War, and really it puts it in context of this war of colonial powers for territory in North America, highlighting the difficult situation, the impossible situation, the terrifying situation that put indigenous Americans in, caught between these two powers, and how the American colonists played a key role in securing most of North America, or at least North America east of the Mississippi, for the British Empire, and how that kind of set the stage for the American Revolution and independence and other things. But I thought this was a really good book. It's not very long. It's a good introduction to the topic. Speaking of another book that's not very long, which I found to be incredibly valuable, and that is just The American Revolution, A History by Gordon S. Wood. Wood is a well-known historian who, by the way, will come up here again later, I think, a well-known, well-respected historian. And this really is a book more of essays on specific topics. So if you were to look at the table of context would be the growth of movement in the population, British reaction to things going on, and it's not very long, but I think it provides some really good introductory kind of outlines from a great historian's point of view about topics related to the American Revolution. And if you already kind of know the basics of the American Revolution, I think this will get you in depth on certain topics in a quick and reliable way that will provide you more insights and, like I said, greater depth to your thinking. One of the most popular books on my list, I think, was Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. By the way, while I'm talking about this, I think Ellis, there was some controversy. I don't remember if it was Ellis or not, and if it wasn't, I'm really sorry, Joseph J. Ellis. But I'm not taking any of that into account. I'm just kind of looking at the work itself and not really evaluating the historian. This basically then looks at the men who we consider to be the founding fathers of the United States, their relationship to one another, their ideas, how they work together. I thought it was a really good, insightful book, and again, it's not very long. It only comes in at about 250 pages. Because I had that video about slave narratives and that kind of period of time between the founding period and the American Civil War, I don't have books from that time period on this list. I've talked about books from that time period in other places on my channel, so I'm not going to go over those again, but I'm going to skip ahead to the Civil War. So I have two books related to the Civil War that I wanted to put on this list. I'm not sure about the availability of either one, but I think both provide really great insight into the Civil War and Reconstruction. So again, this is based on the assumption that you know something about the Civil War. If you don't, it'd be helpful to read like a brief history of the Civil War before picking these books up. But the first book I wanted to recommend is this book, Embattled Courage, The Experience of Combat in American Civil War by Gerald E. Linderman. This is a book I was actually assigned in a graduate course. And for a graduate course, academic history book, I found it to be incredibly important to understanding the mindset, the values of the culture and soldiers and people who fought the Civil War, and why they behaved the way they did, and why they were willing to sacrifice themselves in the way they would. And really the difference then between people and their way they thought about country and cause back then and the way we think about it today has really dramatically changed. I just thought this book was great. It talks about the reasons why soldiers didn't like to retreat, the reasons why soldiers, if they were called to retreat, would walk backwards so they wouldn't get shot in the back, the willingness of soldiers to endure tremendous suffering without drawing attention to their suffering during the war, kind of horrendous things they went through because of the lack of medical knowledge at the time. I just really thought this book was great. And then the other book I wanted to mention here is another book I read in that same graduate class, and that's called The Ghost of the Confederacy by Gaines M. Foster. This is an old book, and so it's going to show its age when you read it. And again, it's only around 200 pages of actual text. But I think this book does a good job of setting up how the South went from losing the Civil War to kind of winning the battle for our memory of the Civil War. And it really lays a lot of the foundations for the way the Civil War has become something we associate with the South and the lost cause and the daughters of the American Confederacy. I think it does a really good job of that. If it's an incomplete introduction, incomplete picture that it provides because of its age, it does a good job of introducing that subject. And while I'm here, let me just mention this is not one of the books, but what also then really, I think, draws a lot of nuance to that topic is This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, which I'll discuss in that video. I discussed in that video about books by female historians. So skipping ahead then over everything to World War II, I have one World War II book, and that is Citizen Soldiers by Stephen Ambrose. This is kind of, the book that came out after Band of Brothers, which was by far more famous. This says the U.S. Army from Normandy beaches to the Bulge and the surrender of Germany. This is kind of a more comprehensive look at the soldiers who fought the war and the war itself. It is going to be very pro-American. Ambrose, a conservative historian who, by the way, also charges of plagiarism, etc. But I found this book to be really good in terms of kind of giving the soldier eye experience of what went on and how things worked, and it kind of inspired my last work in that way. And then skipping ahead to the 50s, one of the decades I think is the most underread about and underappreciated in American history, but incredibly pivotal to most of the rest of the 20th century. I chose, out of several books about the 50s, I chose In the Time of the Americans by David Fromkin. Now, I think technically this goes in the late 40s, maybe to the early 60s. It says FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Marshall, MacArthur, the generation that changed America's role in the world. I really think this is just a great book kind of setting up what we would call this period of American hegemony, of American dominance. I'm not telling you it's not pro-American in its outlook. I think it certainly is. But you're wise enough readers to detect and discard those things and to question those things on your own, which, by the way, is a point I'm going to make here again later. For the civil rights movement, I don't think you can do much better, in my opinion, that you can do much better for kind of like the next thing to read after your introduction than to read the graphic novel series March, which is about the life of John Lewis. There are 3 volumes of this. I just thought they were great. Give you insight into Lewis, the inner workings of the civil rights movement, the disputes between the groups, Lewis's role, Lewis's belief, but also then the civil rights movement in its broader context. I thought they were really good. If you're from my generation, and I'm 56 as of a couple of days ago, if you're from my generation, the Vietnam War really still loomed large in popular culture and American culture in the 80s. And so I included a book about Vietnam, and this is just a general history of Vietnam by Stanley Karnow. I don't believe Karnow is a historian, I believe he was a journalist, but this is a really pretty complete picture Vietnam, why we were there, the things that went on, the war itself. I really enjoyed this book and thought it was great. Now we get to the area where these are definitely books I've talked about on my channel before, and I would say that both of them are relatively controversial, and they're controversial because they take a position which runs counter to or reinterprets the way traditional American history was taught. So the first of those is a book that I've praised many times, and that is Our History is the Future by Nick Estes. Nick Estes is an indigenous American man, and he is calling for continued resistance by indigenous Americans to encroachments of the United States government and capitalism on Native American land, and in doing so he references Native American history, and I found it to be great, and I'm going to consider it a work of history, even though it is also kind of a political manifesto and a call to action. And then you should not be surprised, because I put this book on a lot of lists, and that is the 1619 Project, which came out a few years ago and contains the work of all kinds of historians and writers and cultural people, critics, etc., and that created a tremendous amount of controversy and kind of kicked off the whole concern about critical race theory in American schools and all those kind of things, and it became controversial because a group of leading historians, including Gordon S. Wood, wrote a letter to the New York Times kind of calling out some of the factual inaccuracies they saw in the book, and I am aware of all of that. But I think this is the exact kind of American history book people should be reading, because it forces you to think about how you feel about these issues. It forces you to evaluate. It forces you to read critically, to test what this book is saying against what you already think you know, and to come out with a better, clearer picture. And I can think of no greater function of history than that. And so I'm not asking you to agree with everything in the 1619 Project. As a matter of fact, I am challenging you to read it and disagree with it, to read it and come up with your own ideas, to read it and test what your beliefs are and see, does this book open up new avenues of thought and thinking? If you don't know, the 1690 Project essentially covers racial relations in the United States of America from the first enslaved people who arrived in Virginia in 1619 up through the present day, more or less. And I found it to be incredibly insightful. There were lots of things in the book I thought, hey, I didn't know that, or hey, let me look more up at that, or hey, I need to think more about that, or hey, I think this has gone a little too far. But I just thought it was a great book and a great reason to read American history. Anyway, there you go. There is my list of 11 recommended American history books. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching.